And welcome back to Coast to Coast. I'm George Norrie. Cindy, what can people do to help out, get more information? Go to the Bioinitiative report and see that?
Well, there are a couple of things. I don't want... The Bioinitiative report is a great big 650-page science and public health policy report, and that's perfect for people who like that kind of reading. But I think a really good... overview of this is on a YouTube interview that I just did for EON, the Ecological Options Network. And if you Google up my name plus Bioinitiative, you can get a link to that, or we can figure out how to get that to people. But if you want a good overview of what it says in real English, that interview is pretty good. The other really excellent source for information for the public is a group on the East Coast called the EMR Policy Institute. They're at www.emrpolicy.org. And they've been around a long time, helping communities figure out how to deal with wireless issues. They're very, very good about referring to experts when you have technical questions. And they're working hard to try to convince people that we need some new standards at the federal level, and they're very knowledgeable.
And they can help? Do they want to help?
Yeah, they sure do. They've been to the Supreme Court twice already on the pennies they get in as a nonprofit. So they've just done an astounding job. Their effort has been assisted by lawyers, donating time and so on, but they've been very effective at getting the message out that the science supports new standards, and the standards we have today, which are based on, thermal effects, what burns you can hurt you. That's the entire basis for the standards we have today, and they're completely outdated. And do we have proof of this yet? No. But do we have enough evidence to know we ought to make a change? Oh, yeah. So the EMR Policy Institute is really the singular, the premier, the standout advocacy group in the U.S. And they also coordinate with a lot of groups in Europe, Asia, and Australia. So if people want to email to Jan Newton at the EMRpolicy.org, you can email to me, and I'll give you these links, or you can go to www.emrpolicy.org and look them up.
How did you get involved in this, Cindy?
My background is in science, and I went to school to get enough degrees in science so I could do better environmental land use planning. This was back in the late 60s and early 70s. And I opened a company in 1973, I think it was, to try to do a better job at preserving and protecting environmental resources, and at the same time protecting people from things in the environment that seismicity, earthquakes, active faults, and so on. And I taught at University of California, Santa Barbara, for a number of years part-time as I was running my company in order to develop the environmental studies program. And it's training of people to do these things. And along the way, being a teacher and running a consulting firm, I started to get invitations to look at cases involving power lines. And I didn't know anything that was special about power lines back in 1980 or 81 or 82. But I was hired on as an expert witness for a case where a power line was going to run through some property. And I started looking at the health studies. And there weren't very many back then, but the ones that we had said that they caused birth defects in animals, in fetal pigs, in pig farms that were located along and under some big power lines. And they also were linked to childhood leukemia. And the more I learned, the more I realized that this was just one more environmental factor we ought to really be taking into account when we do good land use planning. And as it happened, we won a large award for someone because the case was clear that we knew a little bit at that time, and this was 20 or more years ago, that power lines were linked to health effects in children. And that was all we knew, just a little bit. And over the years, our company has been asked to look deeper and deeper into this from our point of view as environmental professionals. And what we know today is that there is a very solid science linking childhood leukemia to power line exposure at 2 or 3 or 4 milligauss.
Cindy, how close do you have to get to a power line overall?
It depends on how big it is. The voltage class or how big that power line is and how much electric current it carries determine that. So we have the computer model to actually tell you. But generally, it's a few hundred feet or more on either side of a 115 to 230 kV line, and it can be as much as 1,000 feet on either side of center line for 500 kV.
And they can't put shields under these things?
No. You can't shield a magnetic field from a power line. You can shield a sub-panel in your home or a building. You can shield a little spot on a wall with mu metal or low carbon steel, but you can't realistically shield an entire home. We've actually done computer modeling on this and found that it's just not possible. You can shield for radio frequency from cell phone towers and so on a lot better than you can for power frequency fields from power lines.
So we're out of luck.
Well, I'll tell you, from my point of view, having been one of the governor's appointees to the California Public Utility Commission EMF program consensus group, a group of people appointed to go slug this out back in 91 and 92, what we found is that the utilities were well aware at the time of the biological effects and adverse health effects related to power line exposure at very low levels with chronic exposure, like living in a house next to a power line. And they knew the numbers, and they've been stalling and obfuscating for 20 years now to try and prevent any substantial mitigation from occurring in California. And today, what we know from another point of view, from the World Health Organization, IARC, the International Agency for Cancer Research, is their group in WHO that decides what is a carcinogen and what isn't. And they have categorized EMF, which is power frequency field stuff that we're talking about from power lines, as a group 2B carcinogen or possible carcinogen. And in the ranking, that is not an insignificant ranking. A possible carcinogen, let's see, what are some others? Lead is one, and DDT is one. So, there is worldwide recognition now that this is linked to childhood leukemia. But rather than our utilities saying, okay, people ought to build away, they ought to distance, or we ought to underground and reduce these fields where we can do it, they're saying, nah, that's tough. People ought to get educated and be smart enough not to live in those houses. They ought to not build those houses. So they're shifting the burden back to the public.
Which is typical.
Well, what's so sad about it is that the cost of undergrounding for 66 kV lines, which are the standard community server lines, is really insignificant in comparison to the property value loss adjacent by not doing it.
I think all power lines should be underground.
Well, there's a big difference for power lines that are under 200 or 230 kV versus over that size. This is technical stuff, but let me try and make it easy for people who don't know power line sizes. When you see the big metal towers or the Cat ear towers, big silver, supports on them, they're probably transmission lines. They might be 500s, which are pretty much the biggest we have in California. They're the ones that transfer power, across whole states and whole parts of the country. And the next category down is 220 or 230 kV. Now, these two sets of voltage classes are hard to underground and expensive because they generate so much heat. It's really costly to do it. It can be done, but I wouldn't recommend it. I would recommend these are things that we probably need for the infrastructure, but we shouldn't be building near them. And these things ought to be located out where they do not impact urban populations. Now, when you get down below 200, maybe but certainly below that, there is no excuse for not undergrounding with the technology we have that doesn't require cooling stations, doesn't require air conditioning. And the price is low, and you can do it through all kinds of terrain. And with something called cross-linked polyethylene or